The gulls followed the tug like faithless priests, calling benedictions over rust and wake as the gray hulk turned her bow toward the river mouth. Katria Vale stood on the tug's afterdeck with wind clawing her coat and salt dampening her hair, eyes fixed on the giant that dwarfed every building on the shoreline. The carrier's island rose like a broken cathedral, its antennas bent into question marks, its flight deck scarred with old lifelines and forgotten painted lines. People on the pier had taken out their phones to film. You didn't see a ship like this move often. You didn't see a woman by one at all. She felt the stares even from 100 yards. The headlines had trained them: heirs wastes inheritance on dead warship, vanity project and steel, the last extravagant mistake of a girl who had never learned the cost of screws and bread. They didn't know about the bakeries she shut to pay for hospice when her mother's lungs had failed without warning. They didn't know the price of grief that keeps rolling interest like a cruel bank. They didn't know that she was not wasteful, only stubborn enough to spend her life on something that could hold it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The tug gave a shudder as the towline took strain. Jiro, the captain, leaned from his wheelhouse door and called, "Last turn at slack. After this, she's yours, Katria." He meant more than the berth. He meant the responsibility that could crush a spine you couldn't see. Katria nodded without looking away from the carrier's hull. There were patches on patches, a palimpsest of repairs across the steel in squares like grafted skin. She knew every weld seam on paper already. She'd spent nights with blueprints, diagrams, maintenance logs, half redacted and the other half awkwardly photocopied, until the symbols ghosted behind her eyelids. But standing in the wind with the giant moving toward the slip, paper vanished, swallowed by scale and smell. The ship exhaled cold iron, old paint, tang of oil, and something else, a faint sweetness of long-stored things. A microphone squealed on the pier. The Port Authority man, Nevis, the one who had smiled with all teeth and no mouth last week, lifted a hand for the cameras. Historic day, he proclaimed to the phones and the one rented news camera. Historic vessel. New owner. Economic opportunity. Katria lifted her hand once. She didn't feel like a ribbon. She felt like a gasket. A woman beside Nevis wore a scarf the color of fresh bruises and an expression that said she'd been assigned ship duty as punishment. "Miss Vale," she called when the tug came alongside the pier. "Are you anxious the project will sink your capital?" Katria let the wind skim a smile off her mouth. "If it sinks, I'll learn to weld faster." Jiro laughed once, quiet, then cut power. The tug's diesel thrum relaxed into a purr. Lines snaked and landed, shouted words snapping across water. The carrier eased her bulk into the berth with a sigh that ran up through steel into Katria's bones. She felt it an instant before the fenders squealed, not sound, but a pressure change like an approaching storm. The ship always spoke in weight. The first step aboard felt like stepping onto a stage made for giants. The gangway clanged underfoot, and then she was at the sponson door, paint chalking her palm, a padlock decapitated. "Welcome home," said Maeve Rook behind her, voice muffled by the respirator slung at her throat. Maeve's hair was buzzed close, her cheek tattoo a thin line of ivy like a private joke she carried everywhere. She was a marine electrician by trade, a scavenger by temperament, and the first person who had believed that the ship could become something other than a cautionary tweet. "Not home," Katria said softly. "A stubborn place to be." They stepped inside. Cold swallowed them whole. The passageway exhaled dust and darkness. Maeve flipped a light on her hard hat and the beam carved a tunnel out of gray. Paint blistered where salt had crept. Door dogs sat like frozen knuckles. In the old days there had been 100,000 square meters of lit rooms and hot coffee and men who slept in stacked racks. Now, there was only air heavier than silence. A set of footsteps joined theirs. Ortega, who'd been a bosun on ships longer than Katria had been alive, brought up the rear with a coil of line over his shoulder as if the habit was a talisman. One of his hands was stiff with arthritis and the other could still tie a bowline one-handed in the dark. He had been the only one at the first survey who had not made a joke about her buying an anchor with a ship attached. When people asked him why he signed on with an owner whose boots were barely scuffed, he would take off his cap and rub the seam where the sun had chewed his scalp and say, "Because she remembers to say good morning to the ship." Now, Ortega paused in the hatch and bowed his head. Permission to come aboard, he told the empty air. Katria felt it again, the way the air changed when you treated a thing as if it were listening. She had done it with her mother's hospice bed. She did it now. Permission granted, she said, and the deck seemed to settle beneath her boots. They spent the first day in the places where light still belonged. The hangar bay was a cavern with a rib cage of girders, dotted with fattened puddles that remembered last week's storm. Their breath turned visible. A forklift they'd rented for the week coughed reluctantly into life, and Maeve rolled up hangar doors to spill pale autumn sun across the deck. Anything that could fall was roped. Anything that could cut was flagged. The ship answered everything with echoes that returned a little late, as if it lived a few seconds behind them. "You'll sleep on paper tonight," Maeve predicted, prying open a breaker panel along the bulkhead. "Blueprints under the pillow. Manuals for a blanket. I'll sleep when the fire systems are at least believing in themselves again," Katria said. She had a list in her pocket, another on her phone, and a third in her head that ordered itself by weight. There were things you could buy, hoses, extinguishers, signage, and things you had to earn, like trust from men whose lives had been a rhythm of command and watch and who now watched a civilian lay a hand on their old ghost. By dusk, the hangar had a work table, a line of charged extinguishers, a rescue stretcher hung in reach, and a portable generator purring in the corner like a cat that would take off your fingers if you assumed it was tame. They heated soup in a dented pot on a camping stove and ate standing up because the deck was too cold for sitting. "What's the plan?" Ortega asked when spoons quieted. "Electric first," Maeve said around steam. "Lights you can trust. Then water to the heads so we stop pretending that buckets are a culture. Then we scrape. Then we scrape more." Katria swallowed and looked at the far bulkhead, at a square of paint the wrong color as if it had been patched by a man who had something better to do than match hues. "And before that," she said, "we find the sound." Maeve's eyebrow walked up. "What sound?" Katria did not answer immediately. She let the quiet settle until she could be sure of her own senses. There it was again, a soft series of clicks like a metronome that had learned to hesitate. She'd heard it when they stepped aboard but had filed it under nerves. It repeated now, then stopped as if embarrassed. Metal does that, she told herself. Metal cools and contracts. Ships talk to themselves after a move. But the clicks did not move around the space like heat does. They came from somewhere specific in the forward hangar, then repeated with a spacing that made her mouth go dry. "Morse," Ortega said before she could. His ruined hand twitched as if it remembered taps on a tabletop in a storm. "Not any word I know. Pace is wrong. But that's someone trying to be a language." Maeve set down her spoon. "Could be a loose cable biting a stanchion." "Could be," Ortega said. "Could also be a ship that doesn't like being asleep." They searched with their ears first. Katria walked the hangar with her fingertips brushing the bulkhead until her skin felt it as much as her bones. The taps were faint, but they were not random. There was a pause that felt like thought. She turned slowly in place and the sound seemed to align with an old double door at the hangar's forward end, the hinges corroded into sculpture. "We're not opening that tonight," Maeve said, already rolling her shoulders against the ache a crowbar promised. "You've got 3 generators and 6 flashlights in the world. That door eats daylight." Katria nodded. The clicks stopped as if they'd been waiting for consent. "Tomorrow," she promised softly. She wasn't sure to whom. The first night on the carrier was a cold bargain. They unrolled sleeping bags in a room off the hangar whose windows still held glass, set a space heater with more red tape than confidence, and strung a line of battery lanterns like a cheap holiday. Ortega slept with his cap on. Maeve slept with a wrench in reach. Katria slept past all the first alarms and woke with rope marks across her palms and blueprints under her cheek, exactly as Maeve had predicted. She dreamt that the ship was a city under glass, and she walked through streets named after storms. She dreamt that the island's windows were eyes that remembered everything. She dreamt of her mother's hands threading needles in the bakery, and how those hands had stilled, and how the quiet in the apartment had grown teeth. When she woke at a slap of sound, her heart already knew what it was. Someone was aboard. The lanterns still glowed. Maeve was on her side, mouth open, snoring like a saw through wet timber. Ortega breathed through his teeth in a whistle he claimed had once charmed fish aboard. The sound had not come from them. It had come from the passage beyond their door. Leather against paint. A careful step. Katria moved like a cat afraid of becoming glass. She slid on her boots, took the flashlight with the beam that didn't scream across metal, and stood with her weight wrong deliberately, to make her steps quiet. She put her hand on the knob and waited as a child waits for thunder. 3 footfalls. A breath that she could feel in her throat but not hear. The particular small creak that a man makes when he moves a shoulder that has been broken before. She opened the door quickly, because fear gets stronger on a count of 3. The passage was empty. She took 2 steps and raised the light, cutting a narrow blade into the dark. The beam found a tape line across the deck where someone had once marked a hazard. It found a smear of old grease. It found the junction of 2 bulkheads where a conduit once ran. It also found a line of fresh shoe prints she had not put there. She crouched. The prints were made by boots with soles like city shoes, not shipwear. They had not dusted over yet. She could smell the ghost of rubber and rain. Katria followed them to a ladder well that felt colder than the air around it. She held the light in her teeth and descended, counting rungs like prayers. The ship closed around her. The air smelled of old cotton and damp paper. She moved through a door whose dog had been greased recently, then another whose gasket still coughed back when you squeezed it. Footsteps above. Maeve's voice, Ortega's voice. Her name, not shout loud but urgency sharp. She nearly answered, and then the boot soles told her what to do. They turned right at a cross corridor that dead-ended on the diagram in her head. They did not dead-end in front of her. The wall bore a seam so perfect the painter had been proud of it. On one side of the seam, the paint was 2 shades truer than the rest. On the other side, it was a tone the color of concealment. The sound of the taps at the hangar door lived here in a different animal. Metal expanded and contracted around a void. Katria swallowed. Her tongue tasted of pennies and cold. She found the place where the seam loosened if you pressed just so, the way a book opens where someone loved it. A rectangle depressed beneath her palm and returned with a slow click that sounded like relief. Behind her, footsteps hurried and stopped. Maeve's breath warmed her ear. "Don't open anything without witnesses," Maeve said softly. "Then watch," Katria answered, and pressed again. The panel did not swing, it withdrew. The sound it made was a sigh with history in it. Dust exhaled. Cold surged, not draft cold but storage cold, a flavor in the nose like old fruit in a cellar. Beyond lay a darkness that was not pitch but velvet, the kind you get behind curtains where people keep secrets and good whiskey. Ortega lifted his lamp. "Sweet saints," he breathed. "This bulkhead isn't on any of your prints." "Not any that want to be seen by daylight," Maeve murmured. Her tone turned to business. "Stop and listen. No hiss. No halon lines. We're not opening a fire system by mistake. Smell?" "Paper," Ortega said. "And ozone." "Old electronics," Maeve said. "Or a storm that went to school." They stepped into the void. The room beyond was long and low, built between the structural bones like a secret attic. Shelves lined both sides, bolted and braced. Boxes slept on the shelves, each with a stencil more careful than the last. The air held no mold. Whatever had been done here had been done with faithfulness. In the beam of Katria's light, dust motes drifted like quiet snow. At the far end of the room stood a steel locker painted with a matte black that ate reflections. A brass plaque on its door was covered in grime and grease as if the ship had tried to thumbprint it. Katria wiped with her sleeve until letters rose like a bruise, Project Ithaca. "Did that project ever make your FOIA packet?" Maeve asked. Katria shook her head. Her pulse ticked in her throat. The clicks, the pseudomorse, the metronome, came again from somewhere close, and now she knew what they were, a relay waking and sleeping, a machine that had been faithful past any reasonable expectation. She crossed the room and set her palm on the locker door. It was cold through her glove. The lock was a mechanical hasp, not electronic. She reached up to the shelf where people hide keys if they believe themselves clever, nothing but dust. She crouched and peered under where people hide keys if they believe in gravity, dust, and a dead spider curled as if in prayer. Ortega passed her a wrench and a look that said he knew exactly what had to be done and also that he would pretend he did not. She fit the wrench to the hasp bolt and leaned, expecting resistance, rage from the steel, the ancient obstinacy of salt. The bolt moved like a knee that had been walked every day. Someone had opened this recently. The knowledge ran through her fingers into her ribs. She looked over her shoulder and met Maeve's eyes, wide, hard, and interested. They had assumed they were the first. They had been wrong. Katria turned the bolt until it was free and then stopped. "Record," she said. "If this is a crime, at least we'll be the ones who documented it." Maeve lifted her phone into the beam and already the camera recorded dust like stars. Katria pulled the latch. The locker door swung a finger's width and resisted, as if there were a rubber gasket within. She tugged. The seal gave with a small cry that made the hair lift on her arms. Cold rolled out. She opened the door. Inside was not a locker but a coffin the shape of a standing man. Not wood. Not stone. A capsule with pipes like veins and a small round window at shoulder height. Lines connected the capsule to a box on the interior wall with indicator lights that should have died years ago and had not. The lights pulsed weakly in a rhythm that made her breath copy it. Next to the window, a label, Data Core Access. Below that, a dial with a tiny engraved warning, "Do not activate outside authorized hand." Maeve swore softly, like breaking a breadcrumb between fingers. What in God's hardware store? Ortega crossed himself. "They put a man in a thermos," he said. Katria stood so still her breath made the frost around the capsule's window flower and vanish. She felt small and large at once, as a child does in a planetarium when the sky pours down without permission. She placed her hand on the glass. The cold bit like a story you shouldn't have told. Her voice was calm because it had to be. "It's not a person," she said. "It's a drive. Or a recorder. The window is to check frost, not faces." "Then why do I see one?" Ortega whispered. She would have said he was lying if the shape had not resolved with the clarity of her own pulse, not a face you could measure with a ruler. Not features. The impression of a profile in the frost, as if breath had painted it once and then gone away. The glass cleared where her hand warmed it. Behind it, something round and black held the light and threw none back. A camera eye or a lens. Katria found the panel on the wall that fed the capsule. It had a switch with a metal guard. The wire bundles were taped with a care that made her throat tight. Someone had loved this piece of work even if they were doing something terrible. She flipped the guard up and laid her finger on the switch without moving it. The relay at the back of the room clicked and the pseudomorse answered with eagerness. "Wait," Maeve said. "We don't know what drain this will put on your feeble prayer wheels." Katria did not turn. She did not lower her finger. "We don't have to power the world. Just this. Just long enough to see whether we're looking at an archive or a sin." Ortega muttered something to saints whose jurisdiction included ships and the people who break them lovingly. "If it starts screaming, we shut it. If it starts talking, we listen." Katria pressed the switch. The room breathed. Not air. Not real breath. The sound a seal makes when it seats. The faintest thrum as a pump that had trained itself not to die came to attention after a vigil so long it had forgotten the date. The indicator lights steadied. The frost at the capsule's window began to run like tears toward the sill. Somewhere inside metal, a needle moved like a swimmer waking. "Katria," Maeve said quietly. "Your name is on my insurance, which is a napkin. Think twice. I have been thinking for 3 years, Katria said. The words surprised her. They felt old and sharp and right. I thought when I sold the apartment with the kind window. I thought when I signed my mother's name on the last line. I thought when I wired the money for the ship and watched the numbers turn to air. Thinking doesn't stop you from having to do a thing. The capsule gave a sound like ice surrendering. A light above the window hummed, then came on, the color of cheap hospitals and old heavens. The round black glass behind the frost brightened until it wasn't black anymore but deep blue like an old CRT. Lines crawled across it like sleep trying to be language. A voice, no, a tone made of fragments of voices, rose and fell once in the room like something underwater calling another fish. Maeve's wrench was in her hand without her remembering how it got there. Ortega's breath made a rhythm at Katria's back. The blue inside the window resolved. It wasn't a picture. It was a waveform like a city skyline. A cursor blinked. The capsule shuddered once. The speakers that were not there made a sound anyway. Offhand? The letters weren't letters. They were impulses painted into her head as if someone wrote on her thoughts with a cold finger. She felt the question more than heard it. She did not know how she knew what it asked, and then she did. You can't be online, Maeve said to the capsule as if scolding a child caught with a cigarette. There's no network here, sweetheart. There's a portable router upstairs that barely talks to itself. The capsule ignored her. Katria placed her palm flat to the glass without knowing why. The cold bit. She swallowed and spoke to a piece of sleep. No credentials, she said. Only a body willing to listen. The waveform jittered. A lullaby note she didn't recognize rang and was gone. Query, the cold finger wrote. Ship status. Katria's throat had dried into paper. Afloat, she said. Cold iron. On shore power limited. Human presence 3. Human presence 3, the not voice repeated with the satisfaction of a clerk stamping a form. There was a pause in which Katria could hear dust settling on the room's patience. Then, wake? Define wake, Maeve said too quickly. The waveform hesitated. She had the absurd sense of a polite thing turning to look at a loud thing. Then it wrote in her head, safe mode diagnostics open core access. Ortega rubbed the seam of his cap between finger and thumb. This feels like we opened a door and found a tiger who knows how to say please. Katria's finger had gone numb against the glass. She took it away and felt grief at the loss of contact that made no logic. Open to diagnostics, she said softly. No core. She didn't know what core was, not precisely. She knew that words like that in the context of governments and seagoing vaults never meant something you could drink without burning your tongue. The capsule sighed again, and something within turned like old galaxies. The waveform flattened, became a line as thin as a hair, then returned with a precision that made her think of librarians. A series of lights switched from red to amber to green in order. In the far corner of the secret room, one of the boxes on the shelf made a hesitant hum and the relay clicked in a short happy laugh. Tell me what Project Ithaca is, Katria said to the waking machine. Mission classified, wrote the cold finger. Offhand required. Who are you? Subsystem, Archive Vault. Designation, Kai. A pause. Hello. It said hello like a person who has practiced greetings alone in a mirror. Maeve made a noise like a screw falling in a sink. Great, she said. You bought a ship and it came with a roommate. Katria tasted copper and realized she'd bitten her lip. Hello, Kai, she said. I'm Katria. She had never spoken her name into a refrigerator before. The machine's blue eye flickered. Katria Vale. A pause long enough to fill a teacup. Match, next of kin, Vale, Marion. The cold in the room grew teeth so fine she could hear them grow. Katria stared at the window as if it could become a face and tell her she had misheard. Repeat, she said, as if asking a friend who'd made a cruel joke. Next of kin, Vale, Marion. The words did not change. Offhand possible. requesting permission. Her mother's name occupied the room the way a storm occupies a coast. Maeve swore again, differently this time. Ortega stepped backward as if he had given them privacy. My mother worked at a bakery, Katria whispered to Steele. She iced pastries. She hated computers because she said they didn't smell like anything. Auth hand possible, repeated the cold finger, patient as a nurse. Request permission to verify. She could have stepped back. She could have shut the door and shut the panel and told the poor authority man that she had found a breach repaired and nothing more. She could have turned the machine off by pulling a plug the way you save a bad cake by calling it pudding. There were lives that had gone well because someone chose not to know. Verify, Katria said, because she had not bought a ship to learn how to lie to it. The capsule warmed under her hand as if it had been waiting all these years not for a code but for a person who would say yes. The waveform rose and a soft tone chimed, 3 notes in a song she had heard once and then again the night her mother had died, a melody the hospice nurse hummed because she said it worked on babies and old men alike. Verification in progress, Kai wrote. Please place your hand on the glass. Katria's hand was already there. She could feel every line of her palm mirrored back in pain. Something beneath the glass scanned in a pulse like echo sounders at sea, sweeping out, returning with confessions. It's not biometric, Maeve breathed. It's just theater. Match 87%. Seeking secondary vector. Katria could not swallow. Secondary, what? Voice. The machine wrote gently. Say your name. Katria Vale, she said, and her voice sounded like it came from the other end of a long hallway. Match 91%. Seeking tertiary vector. Enough, Maeve snapped. I don't like this math. It wants blood next, I can smell it. Memory trace, the machine wrote. What? Katria asked. HUM, it repeated with infinite patience. A song Marion Vale sang. Katria's mouth made a shape that wasn't a word and then was. She could see the bakery light in late winter, her mother's hair unpinned, flour dusting the edge of a cheekbone. A melody rose in her throat not because she reached for it but because it reached for her, absurd and tender, a children's song about a lighthouse. Her voice shook on the first note and steadied by the second. She sang 3 measures and stopped because stopping hurt less than finishing. The blue eye brightened until the capsule seemed to breathe and see. Offhand confirmed. Maeve took a step backward into a shelf. Ortega sat down because his legs had decided to pray without asking him. Katria kept her hand on the glass because letting go had become a kind of death. Kai, she said softly. Tell me what's in you. Event records, wrote the machine, writing now like water on a window. Flight data, it wrote. Chain of custody. A beat that felt like a throat clearing. Proof. Proof of what? Katria asked, and thought of lawsuits like storms. The pause that followed had thought in it. Then, of the thing they said never happened. The thing, Maeve said through her teeth, that always never happens until it does. Katria swallowed a shard of air. Open diagnostics, she said. Show me only the table of contents. She was proud of herself for sounding like an adult in a room where her childhood had just been excavated. The waveform smoothed into columns that were not words and yet told their meaning to her bones. Dates, latitudes, events, references to systems whose acronyms were paper cut sharp. She saw storms at sea. She saw exercises with names like jokes. And then she saw a line that made her skin jump like a startled animal. Item 17, CIC override, undeclared shadow protocol, associated record, hull compartment 4 FWD/sealed. Forward of the hangar, Ortega said faintly. By the double doors. Where you heard the taps. Why double seal something like this inside a ship? Maeve asked the air. Why bury your dead in the walls? Because you plan to raise them later, Katria whispered. The taste of pennies had become the taste of lightning. The relay at the back of the room clicked twice, impatient now. The indicator lights on the wall panel drifted toward green as a hand drifts to a lover's wrist. Somewhere above them the ship shifted, a structural groan like an old man finding a new place for pain. "Stop," Maeve said. "We need bodies with badges to see this. We need a lawyer nobody can afford. We need a fire extinguisher for the whole internet." Katria took her hand off the glass at last and the cold went into her as if it had always belonged there. She turned in the narrow room and looked at her friends. "If this is proof," she said, "then it doesn't belong to whoever hid it. It belongs to the people who were lied to." She heard her mother's humming in the radiator of some lost winter. "I won't let what she paid be spent on silence." She shut the panel to safe and the machine dimmed slightly, as if embarrassed to be looked at. Before it settled, the cold finger wrote one more thing in her thoughts, polite and inexorable as tide. "Katria," it wrote. "There is more." "Of course there is," Maeve said, "because sarcasm is a blanket you can afford when the night is too big. There's always more." Movement detected. The machine wrote, and for the first time its letters had a tremor, not fear, but urgency. "Hangar Bay forward." The three of them were already moving before the message finished. They squeezed through the secret door like toothpaste reversed, took the ladder in a tumble of boots, and broke into the hangar with breath clouding, hearts drumming through layers of shirts. The forward double doors grinned like a broken tooth in the lamplight. Someone stood in front of them. He was slim the way a rumor is slim, with a rain-dark coat and a knit cap pulled low. He carried himself like a man who knew how to carry things without showing them. His hands were empty in the way you learn to make hands empty, fingers loose, wrists quiet, pockets honest. He was young until you looked at his eyes. Then he was a storm that had forgotten its first thunder. Maeve lifted her wrench. Ortega lifted nothing and still seemed armed. The man did not lift his hands in surrender. He looked at Katria and did something far stranger. He smiled like a person who had found the first step of the right staircase and was not sure what the house would do about it. "You're late," he said to her, and his voice carried a harbor in it, that low sure music of people who measure days by tide. He nodded once toward the double doors. "They're going to open on their own. If you don't want to drown, you'll want to stand back." A sound shuddered through the ship, not a creak, not a groan, but the deep inner cough of dogs unlatching that had not known their fathers. The old hinges whispered to each other and the scene between the doors brightened with a light the color of radio. Katria took one step forward and the deck vibrated like a heartbeat in steel. The man in the cap did not move. He looked at her like a lighthouse looks at weather, professional terror with a job to do. "What's behind them?" she asked, though part of her already knew. He blinked as the doors began to separate. "Your inheritance," he said softly. "And the reason they tried to make sure you never found it." The scene widened. Cold rolled over their boots as if someone had opened the belly of winter. Metal sang in a pitch that made her mother's song ache in her throat. From the dark beyond, a shape began to move forward, a curved nose, a ripple of matte skin, a promise of silence that could part oceans. The hangar filled with a smell like rain inside a stone church. The lights flickered once, twice, like nerve signals. And then the ship spoke in a voice she felt more than heard, through her teeth, through the metal, through the capsule still humming in the hidden room. "Katria Vale," said the cold finger in her blood. "Do not be afraid." The doors yawned wide enough for a secret to be born. The shadow within resolved into a smaller hole that did not belong to any museum brochure, a child of stealth with angles that ate light. It was cradled on rails, poised for a launch that had waited too long. The man in the cap opened his mouth to say one more thing that might have saved or ruined them. The deck lurched, the rails shuddered, and the smaller craft began to slide. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Began to slide. The rails screamed like violin strings tuned to panic. Frost cracked along the sleek little hull and fell in bright flakes that skittered across the deck like frightened silverfish. The craft's nose, shark quiet, swallow dark, glided forward on a cradle whose wheels had not rolled since men wore different uniforms. Cold spilled over Katria's boots and climbed her shins as if winter had decided she was a hill worth taking. Her hands went hot with the stupid instinct to stop a moving ship with fingers. Back, the man in the knit cap called, voice tight but steady. He didn't grab her. He didn't reach. He merely stepped toward the danger himself as if that might convince it to become reasonable. Hydraulics are waking on surge. If the bleed valves choke, she'll dump water where water doesn't belong. Or where someone meant it to belong, Maeve said, wrench raised like liturgy. The little hole slid to a halt with a groan that sounded older than steel. It rocked once in its cradle, settled, and then did the most frightening thing a machine can do, nothing. No alarms. No obliging leak. No theatrical plume of steam. Just a quiet that insisted on being listened to. Catria's breath plumed in front of her teeth. The deck vibrated underfoot, a small pulse that made her think of the capsule in the secret room. "What is it?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the craft. "What am I looking at?" The man's smile this time was tired, affectionate, and profoundly out of his age. "An argument," he said. "Between Silence and the people who used it. Designation, Literal Reconnaissance Platform, LRP. Unofficially, a ghost that takes dictation." "Drone?" Maeve said. "Half. The other half is a library that swims." His eyes, stonewater gray, slid to Catria's. "The rest is why you're here." "Who are you?" she asked. "Leif Astron," he said. "And before you ask, I'm only good at 3 things: finding doors that don't want to be found, listening to machines lie, and apologizing late." He tipped his chin at the rails. "When you powered the vault, you woke every polite demon chained to it. This one thinks it owes you respect. We need to shut it in," Ortega said. His breath fogged like old prayers. "Before the port boys send anyone with a badge and a bad idea. We can't shut a thing when it's in the middle of deciding who it is," Leif said. He crouched by the cradle and touched a frost-furred cylinder with the backs of his fingers, reverent as someone testing a fever. "She's on interlock. We have a window while she pleads her case to a dead system." The blue in the corner of Catria's vision flickered. She realized she was waiting for Kai to write in her head. She felt a pinch of absurd gratitude when it did. LRP-17. Status, dormant-query. "Can you talk to it?" she whispered. "If you ask," Kai wrote, courteous as ever. Catria stepped close enough that the little craft skinned through darkness onto her boots. Its surface wasn't paint so much as the absence of adjectives. She laid her gloved palm against it. It was cold, but not corpse cold, more like the cold you get from a window against snow, a boundary, not a void. "Hello," she said, and felt ridiculous. "You don't know me." "I'm Catria Vale." The steel didn't answer, but the capsule in the hidden room did. Offhand recognized. Leif's jaw flexed. He had that look again, the one men wear when someone finally turns on a light in their version of the world. "Then you are who I thought you were," he murmured. "Or the person they feared." "Why is my mother in any of this?" Catria asked, the question spilling because her mouth was tired of holding it. "Why does the ship know her name?" Leif's answer didn't come immediately. The silence that held it had weight. He stood, wiped frost off his fingers on his coat, then tugged his cap higher as if his ears needed the cold to keep the math straight. "Because she signed for deliveries at dawn," he said finally, voice pitched so only the deck might overhear. "Because she noticed when men in the wrong jackets came back twice. Because some people write letters that never get answered until Steele can read them. Because she put your last name where someone lazy would not have." Maeve's head turned slowly. "Marion Vale put a hand on a chain and it ran all the way up to this?" Leif nodded once. "A bakery at the mouth of the river can be a lighthouse if you're the one who keeps it lit." Catria felt her throat tighten. She hated that relief could feel like bruising. "So why me?" "Because they tried to erase her, and machines don't forgive erasures." He pointed at the craft. "This one carries a sequence of records that needed 3 keys, a hand, a voice, and a song. They trained it to look for the person who could supply the shape all 3 made together if the listed custodian was gone. It thinks that's you." The rails clicked once as if in agreement. Deep in the ship, a pump cycled, pressure changed, a valve considered and chose. The deck exhaled. Fine, Maeve said, brittle. We have a secret fish with a conscience. We have a ghost librarian. We have a man named after a myth. What we don't have is time. Nevis is going to arrive with a tour of officials who smell of microphones. We either hide this or drive it somewhere sensible. Drive it? Ortega said, scandalized. On a Sunday? On the hour where Sundays are being invented as an alibi, Maeve snapped. Leaf straightened. You can't launch her. The outer doors are locked by weld you'd need 3 days to argue with and a permit that would turn our names into searchable terms. But you can wake her mind. He bent, found a manual lever half hidden under a fairing, and pulled gently until a mechanical latch spoke in a click older than code. The craft's nose opened the way a throat opens to sing, revealing a cavity that was not an engine room but a clavichord of slots and sockets. Katria leaned in. Everything in her wanted to keep it clean by not being alive near it. The central slot was the right size for a drive shaped like a small book. Above it, etched in the careful arrogance of defense contractors, a phrase, course/return, chain of custody absolute. Her skin remembered the capsule's window like a burned tongue remembers lemon. Kai, she said slowly. You called your heart a core. Is this where you? Interface confirmed. If we marry them, Maeve said, does it explode, confess, or both? Leaf looked at Katria with a kind of permission no one had ever offered her outside of death and paperwork. It's yours, he said. That's the law I believe in. She didn't move immediately. The weight of choice is lighter than the weight of regret until you hold it the wrong way. She thought of her mother humming over sugar like a person who knows that sweetness is a kind of architecture. She thought of the hospital's last white, of the apartment window that held the river like a patient. She thought of the headlines, and Nevis, and the bruise-eyed reporter who had asked if she was anxious it would sink her capital. Then she turned on her heel and ran. The secret room had the air of a chapel after a wedding, the sense that what just happened would become ordinary only if the world was very brave. The capsule's eyes still glowed deep blue. The relay clicked twice like a polite throat. Maeve's footsteps hammered behind her, Ortega's made rope sounds, Leaf's were silent the way a thief's feet apologized to floors. Katria flipped the guard and moved the switch. Good morning, Kai wrote into her head as if morning could be summoned by manners. Core, she said, breath fogging. I need you. The capsule's inner mechanisms shifted. The window cleared completely, she saw not a face but a geometry behind glass, stacked plates, a spindle that drank light, the suggestion of something grown rather than built. The front of the capsule clicked and slid, a handle presented itself like a hand. The engraved warning watched her with its little seriousness. Maeve touched her elbow. If it fights you, she said, let go. Pride is not data. Katria curled her fingers around the handle. Cold climbed into her palm like information. She pulled. The core came free with the reluctant grace of a tooth that knows a child is ready. It was heavier than it looked and warmer. She cradled it as she had cradled the urn her mother had not wanted. She did not look away from it even as she spoke. Coming back, she told the ship, and found that she meant the sentence in a larger grammar. They crossed the passageways at a half-run. The carrier seemed to make way for them in small kindnesses, a hatch dog that spun without swearing, a deck plate that didn't snatch a boot heel, a lamp that decided to keep working a few minutes past its dignity. They reached the hangar, where the little craft waited with its mouth open like an animal about to be fed. Katria slid the core into the slot. It seated with a soft thunk that traveled up her arms. A low tone sounded that made her think of a lighthouse chorus, low, long, not warning exactly, but boundary-making. Chain of custody, accepted. Kai wrote. Katria Vale, custodian. A panel on the craft's spine lit, one rectangle at a time, like a city coming awake street by street. Leaf's shoulders eased by a fraction of an inch. Maeve's knuckles remained white on the wrench because some hands don't unlearn their jobs just because a new idea has appeared. The hangar filled with a breath, not air, a presence. The craft vibrated at a frequency that made her teeth feel wholly hers. A voice came, not written into her head this time but riding the thin air like a thought skipping stones. "Custodian," it said. The word had the shape of both recognition and request. "Instructions?" Katria's throat hurt. "Tell me what you carry," she said, and surprised herself by adding, "please." "Event records," the craft said. The voice was not gendered, not age-fixed, polite with an undertow of steel. "Observations." "Proof." "Location seeds." "A map of the sea you were never meant to know." "Is proof," Maeve said, eyes on the hangar door, "flammable?" "Proof," the craft said, "is a solvent. Handle with care." Leaf moved to the hatch controls and began the long, dull work of safetying what could be safetied without clearing alarms. "When they come," he said, "they will carry two kinds of questions, the kind that are really statements and the kind that could get you hurt. You should answer neither." "They can't come yet," Ortega muttered. "They have to scroll through their phones first to find the part where they pretend they always liked you." "But they could." The carrier shivered in that way ships do when attention touches them from the outside. The tug's horn sounded once, curious, not warning. Voices on the pier. The thin bell of a police bicycle because the city liked its illusions archaic. The world was walking toward them with the wrong shoes on. Katria set her palm to the craft's skin again. "Can you show without giving?" she asked. "Let me look without letting it out." "Air-gapped preview," it said. "One viewport." A small door near the slot opened like an eyelid. Inside was a screen no bigger than her hand, matte, patient. It lit with a soft gray and then arranged itself into a list that felt like a sea chart, dates, latitudes, names of operations that tasted like euphemisms. Her eye fell on the line that had dragged her down the ladder before: CIC override, undeclared shadow protocol, associated for FWD/sealed. She tapped it. The screen did not play a video. It offered a diagram, a top-down of the carrier, the forward compartments outlined in red like a crime. Underneath, a single sentence that looked like a wound because of how the font refused its duty to be neutral: command override received from non-ship authority, sealed package embarked, chain of custody altered. "Who altered it?" she whispered. The little screen waited, as if for a permission that was not hers to give. Then it pulsed and wrote, redacted at source. Maeve snorted. "Of course. Can you unredact?" Katria asked. "Not without opening me to the world you're trying to hold away," the craft said. "I can, however, be irritating." "Irritating?" "Correlate, extrapolate, and refuse to forget." The voice almost smiled. "Would you like me to do that?" The interruption did not come from the ship. It came from the hangar door where light turned to shadow and shadow turned to men. Nevis walked in with a reporter he did not respect and a camera operator who looked like he missed his dog. Two uniformed port officers followed like punctuation marks that end sentences you don't like to say. Nevis smiled his mouth-only smile. "Miss Vale," he said, ignoring Maeve, ignoring Ortega, ignoring Leaf because men like Nevis ignore until it becomes inconvenient. "Press interest is at a simmer. I told them you were camera shy. Help me help you." Katria did not move her hand from the hole. "Hello, Mr. Nevis." He stepped forward, then stalled as I registered the sleek black in the forward hangar. His smile cracked like a tile under sudden heat. "What's that?" Not a question. A denial wearing quotation marks. "A compartment we found," Katria said. "You can't have it." He was already angry because that was his nature, not because of facts. "If it's military, it's not yours. If it's not military, it's mine." "It's part of the ship," she said. "I bought the ship." "You bought a hole and a headache," he snapped. "You didn't buy classified headaches." He gestured too fast and the camera operator lifted his lens in the reflex of covering trouble because trouble is always good television. "We'll be taking a look." Leaf moved as if he would stand in front of a train. Ortega merely shifted weight and somehow made the line between standing and barring a door look elegant. Maeve lifted the wrench in a way that wasn't a threat unless you understood tools and people. Katria felt the little crafts hum under her palm. It was not asking. It was agreeing. "This is private," she said quietly. "Please leave." "Private?" Nevis's laugh sounded like dropped cutlery. "You dragged a museum into my river, Ms. Vale. Nothing about you is private." He turned to the reporter. "Get her saying that again on camera. It'll play." "I don't want to be filmed," she said. "Then you shouldn't have bought a building-sized attention magnet," Nevis said sweetly. He looked over her shoulder at the craft like a man who sees a safe he would like to have an opinion about. "Open it." "No," Katria said. The word was small in the big room. It did not need volume. It had weight. Something in it made the port officers look at each other and then at the floor because men who wear uniforms understand weight. Nevis smiled again, all teeth. "Let's not turn goodwill into litigation. I'll make a call." He took out his phone and became a person in a different room without moving. His tone changed Lilliputian, strings of words that meant nothing except the one at the end, authorized. He hung up, put his phone in his pocket as if placing a coin into a wishing well, and said, "Stand clear." "On what authority?" Maeve asked. Nevis brightened. "I'm glad you asked. Maritime safety. Hazard abatement. And to keep you from injuring yourself with your purchase." The craft spoke. It did not make its voice louder. It made it colder. "Custodian," it said. "Is this man's authority recognized?" "No," Katria said. "Understood," the craft said. The lights on its spine blinked in a pattern that felt like someone deciding which door to hold. The air felt drier for a moment, as if humidity had been invited to leave. "You can't refuse," Nevis said, because that was the only language he spoke fluently. Katria kept her hand where it was. "I can," she said. Her heart pounded at the same speed as the little ship's hum. "And if you push, you'll be on record pushing." She nodded at the camera. "You wanted a story, didn't you?" The reporter shifted, empathy warring with hunger. Nevis took one more step. Leaf planted his feet, a quiet violence in his bones. The port officers drew breath to say a sentence about protocols. The carrier saved them from an argument none of them could win. Somewhere forward, a klaxon coughed, an old thing finding its voice. Then another, deeper and true, took up the call, BWOOP, 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 the sound that turns spines into tuning forks. "Flooding alarm," Ortega said, voice gone thin. "Forward compartments." Leaf's head snapped toward the double doors. "Bleed valves choked," he said. Interlock woke the flush. Nevis turned pale. "What did you do?" "We breathed," Maeve said, "and started running." Katria ran with them. The camera operator, to his credit, dropped the lens and helped Ortega move the emergency bar. Cold air knifed their faces as they pushed through into the forward bay beyond the sliding doors. Water frothed around the rails. It wasn't a wall yet, it was a dog that hadn't decided whether to bite. The source hissed behind armored grills that had not expected to report for duty in the century they were living in. "We can't close the doors against a rising head," Leaf said. He was already at a panel, hands flying over manual wheels and levers that hadn't felt respect in decades. "If we try to shut it, we force the stream somewhere else." "Somewhere electrical," Maeve grated. "Like my patience." She flung open a smaller panel and began to work with the wrench as if unscrewing a stubborn idea from a skull. "Kai," Katria said, breath burning. "Can you see?" "Limited." "Can you bleed it down?" "Not without stressing structure." A pause. "But I can suggest." "Suggest," she said. "The valve you need is under the grating. Third bay. Left of the rails." Katria looked. The grating was old, locked to the deck by bolts that had fused out of stubbornness and salt. She dropped to her knees, hands scrabbling for the edges. Her fingers found purchase. She pulled. The metal did not move. Leif knelt opposite her and braced. Ortega brought his old hands, strong as rope. Together, in a chorus of tendons and breath, they lifted the slab and slid it aside with inches for currency. Cold water slapped her wrists like a scold. Below, a valve wheel waited, half-submerged, resilient with time. Maeve slid down on her belly and reached. The wrench sang as it bit. She torqued until her shoulders swore in several languages. The wheel shifted. A tone changed in the deck. The water's push softened by a grain you only hear when your ear is on the floor. There, Maeve gasped. Again. They turned the stubborn circle together, Katria pushing, Maeve pulling, Leif steadying, Ortega anchoring. With each quarter turn, the ship sounded a little less like drowning in slow motion. Water still poured, but the spray eased from vindictive to merely obstinate. The klaxon cut. The silence that replaced it had edges. Nevis leaned in the doorway with the reporter. His face had taken on the pallor of someone who has just watched a chandelier decide not to fall. "This is a hazard," he began, but his voice lacked its lazy confidence. "It's a responsibility," Katria said, standing, soaked to the elbows and feeling more awake than religion. "And I accept it." From behind them, the craft spoke again, voice lower, intimate. "Custodian," it said. "They're coming." Maeve didn't look up. "Who?" "Not the press," it said. "The kind of men who make cameras stop working." Leif's expression closed the way a bay door closes before a storm. "How many?" "2 vans, 5 minutes," the craft said. "They carry non-disclosure agreements like umbrellas." Nevis straightened. "Then we'll step aside and let the adults." "No," Katria said. "Miss Vale," he said, tired of manners. "You can't stop them." "I can make them choose in front of witnesses," she said. She looked at the camera operator, who was shaking just enough to be useful. "You're brave enough to keep shooting?" He swallowed. "I like my dog," he said. "But I also like my job." "That's a yes," the reporter said hoarsely, surprising herself. Leif wiped water off his hands on his coat and gave Katria a look that was not admiration exactly, but was in that neighborhood. "Then we changed the terms of the argument." He pointed at the little craft. "Can you project?" "In the hangar," it said. "Limited brightness." "Show nothing classified," Katria said. "Show enough to make a human heart that once had a mother wonder what was done in its name." The craft hummed. "I have an index of such hearts." They returned to the hangar like a small storm front. The craft's small side panel widened, just a foot, and spilled faint light onto the deck. It did not show moving pictures. It showed words and numbers arranged with the willful simplicity of a ledger. Dates. Coordinates. The phrase temporary custody, private contractor appearing too often for coincidence. A list of vessels in tow one night whose names had been scrubbed from public logs. A line from a maintenance report, sealed item embarked 4 hours prior to departure, captain not briefed, directive from office not located on org chart. The reporter's breath hitched. The camera operator filmed as if the lens could protect him. Ortega said nothing. He watched the projection the way fishermen watch weather reporting from a different century, skeptical, attentive, convinced that the sea will still do what it wants. The first van's brakes squealed like a moral that hadn't been greased. Doors opened. Men in Navy windbreakers stepped out with the weariness of people who would much rather be paid differently. They didn't run. They advanced fast enough to persuade. The one in front had a haircut that told time the wrong things. He flashed a wallet that may or may not have contained authority and used a name nobody would remember in an hour. "We're here to secure federal property," he said. "Nobody moves. Nobody films." "On what authority?" Maeve asked for the second time that morning. He said the name of an agency whose initials meant donor for every rumor. Hazard and Evidence Control. "You're late," Leif said. "Step aside," the haircut said. "No," Katria said. He looked at her, then at the projection spilling weak truth onto Rust. He frowned. "Turn that off." I won't, she said. He took a single step forward and met something he had not anticipated, the gaze of a woman with salt on her wrists who had carried a core through a ship because the dead had asked her. He stopped. He adjusted his tone as if tone was a screwdriver. You don't understand what you're risking. I understand exactly, she said, and was surprised by the steadiness that borrowed her voice. She gestured at the ledger of coordinates and phrases. You boarded a ship. You sealed a compartment. You rewrote a chain of custody and hoped the ocean would keep your secret. It didn't. The ocean gave me a receipt. That's classified, he said. It cannot be in your possession. It is my possession, she said. The ship recognizes me as custodian. The device recognizes me as custodian. Unless you plan to remove my hand, you'll have to learn a different grammar. The man's jaw worked. We can impound. Try, Leaf said, pleasantly. This is a matter of national. Don't finish that, Katria said softly. Don't use the nation to make your secrets brave. The haircut man looked at the camera and calculated. He looked at Nevis, who had the decency to look like a man who wants to be anywhere else. He looked at the projection and saw that it did not flinch. He lifted his phone. He listened to a voice that told him a horizon. We'll be back with a warrant, he said, which is what men say when they are surprised to be the ones leaving. He turned to go. Then he paused. Ma'am, he said, suddenly not a haircut but a tired person. There are things in there that will break you. They already did, she said. That's why I'm still standing. They left. The vans took their rumors away. The hangar exhaled. The ship's bones settled like a choir taking a breath between movements. Nevis began to say something and then didn't. He left, too. The reporter put her card on a crate with hands that trembled and did not apologize for it. The camera operator wiped his eye, blamed the cold, and asked if anyone had a dog treat because he kept them in every pocket and had forgotten this one. Silence rose, soft, altered. Ortega sat on an overturned crate and regarded the little craft the way one might regard an unlikely bird on a gunnel. So, he said. What now? Now, Maeve said, we get power to the things that need it and none to the things that don't. We buy a coffee machine that doesn't cry in lowercase. We teach our lady here to speak in a way that won't set fire to City Hall by accident. Leaf leaned back against the bulkhead and let his knees shake now that the audience had left. And we copy, he said. 3 backups. 5. Hide one where churches forget to dust. Katria nodded. She felt tired all the way through to the idea of sleep. She also felt new, as if something had handed her a name that fit. Kai, she said. What's the thing they said never happened? The craft's projected ledger did not scroll. Instead, the voice spoke quietly enough that even the ship leaned to listen. A convoy, it said. Not of ships. Of people. Moved in darkness. Paid for by departments with no doors. Your mother saw the vans. She saw the faces nobody was supposed to see again. She wrote their names phonetically on flour sacks with a grease pencil so the bags would tell secrets as they were carried away. She sent letters to the wrong offices on purpose because sometimes the wrong person opening the mail is the right thing. Katria closed her eyes. She saw Marion Vale's hands, flour soft, pencil hard. And the ship? Carried them for 2 nights, the craft said. Then carried the memory longer. A pause colored with something like shame. I am very good at remembering. I am less good at acting without permission. Then you have it, Katria said. Permission to remember out loud. Out loud is dangerous, Maeve said. So is breathing, Katria said. We'll choose how loud. But we won't choose silence for them. The day stretched a spine for them to walk on. They worked because work is what people do when history is knocked and the kettle is still on. Maeve rerouted a branch of power through panels that had been waiting to be forgiven. Ortega scraped a line of paint until the ship's true color came through like a healed bruise. Leaf disappeared twice and returned with a bag of pastries from a place that had no right to be open on a Sunday and a bundle of data diodes borrowed from a friend who might not call him friend tomorrow. Katria and the craft talked in low, careful breaths. She asked, it answered in shapes. She learned that it had watched the shore through sensors better at tasting than seeing, that it had listened through water for absent ships, that it had counted engines in convoy and noted where one had gone quiet and then loud again, which meant that someone had refused to give up in the middle of being taken. She learned there were coordinates that were not the sea, an airfield in the dark, a warehouse whose roof collected rain and whistles, a farmhouse with a cellar that had never stored jars. By late afternoon, a pale, dry sun was trying to apologize for earlier. The tug had moved off to another duty. The pier crowd had thinned to the curious and the kind. Nevis had stopped texting her. The men with windbreakers were busy convincing a judge that warrants were urgent and that nobody would post their PDFs within an hour if they succeeded. Katria stood at the edge of the hangar and watched the river. The carrier's island cut a piece of sky into geometry. Her breath no longer smoked. She could almost feel the bakery in her bones, the warmth, the patient clocks. She could almost hear her mother humming because the day had chosen not to break anything too valuable. Leaf came to stand beside her. He drew a line down the river with his eyes, the way a person raised by coasts does without consent. You know they'll come back with paper that thinks it knows your name, he said. I know, she said. We'll read it together. He nodded. You're not safe. I wasn't yesterday either, she said. I just didn't have a ship to tell me so. He considered that, then smiled without weaponry. You did well. She surprised herself by answering honestly. I did, exactly what she would have done if she had liked salt. She looked at him. Why are you here, Leaf? He made a small face, as if caught by a camera and deciding not to lie. Because I held a door open once and heard a sound I couldn't forget. Because some of us are tired of learning the same lesson at funerals. Because I got a letter 5 years ago I didn't understand until this morning. The return address was a bakery. The handwriting was tired. It said, if there's a ship in this city that listens, tell it I am listening back. Katria leaned her shoulder against cold steel. The feeling that arrived wasn't victory. It was alignment. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. You haven't met the part where they offer you money to go away. That's the easiest no I'll ever say. Good, he said. Save your hard no for when they offer to make you a consultant. Twilight came on with theatrical patience. Work lights through modest halos. Ortega brewed coffee in a contraption that had seen wars and refused to learn better behavior. Maeve sat on an overturned crate, grease to her elbows, hair escaping its buzz in soft defiance, and wrote a list titled Things That Won't Kill US If We Touch Them in her blocky, forgiving hand. Kai spoke into the light. Custodian, it said. There is still more. Katria smiled with corners of her mouth she hadn't used in days. Of course there is. Not like before, it said. Not records of others. Records of us. Us? The ship, it said. And the people who made choices inside it. The men who refused. The one who hid the panel and labeled it wrong. The petty officer who rerouted a valve so water would choose a different hallway if someone flooded the forward bay. The woman who wrote Marion Vale's name in a margin on a form and didn't file the form in the right place. The cost was not recorded. Katria put her hand on the craft. She didn't need the chill. She needed the shape. Then we find their names, she said. We say them. Names, the craft said, almost soft. That is a good word to be custodian of. The phone on the crate vibrated. It was not Nevis. It was not a windbreaker. It was a number she didn't know that carried the accent of a county that had learned its vowels in fog. The voice was an old woman's, roughened by cigarettes and grief. Miss Vale, she said. I am told by people who owe me things that you found a ship that remembers. Is that true? I think so, Katria said. My boy never came back, the woman said without introduction. He made 2 phone calls that didn't sound like his mouth, and then he made none. They told me he'd gone away for work that pays in secrets. Then they told me to stop asking because I was embarrassing the country. I am old enough not to be embarrassed by countries. The voice trembled. If your ship remembers him, tell it I am listening. Katria closed her eyes. What's his name? Evan, the woman said. Evan Cross. Kai, Katria said. Do you know that name? The craft answered with a care that felt like the pause between lightning and thunder. I know a route, it said. I know a night where a man with that name carried another man's weight up a ramp with a shoulder that had not healed. I know that when we were ordered to cut our microphones, someone didn't. Katria's breath shook. Then we'll find the rest, she said into the phone, into the hangar, into the ship's patient bones. I can't promise what we'll make. But I promise it won't be silence. Good, the woman said. Silence is just a grave with better manners. The call ended. The hangar listened to itself. Some ships devour moments. This one saved them like seeds. The Warren arrived with the dark. It came in the mouth of a deputy with apologetic eyes and a clipboard too clean. It allowed for inspection and restraint and seizure and 6 other verbs that like to dress up as concern. It did not anticipate a camera. It did not anticipate a city that, for tonight at least, was feeling nosy. We'll comply, Katria said, and then did what compliance sometimes means, made them read it out loud while the craft projected not secrets but the shape of a promise, a list of names she would ask for, a schedule of times she'd be at the pier for families who needed to stand on metal and remember, a line that said, the ship listens. A line under it, so do we. The deputy's eyes softened as he read. The windbreaker men did not soften, but they did not harden either. Paper can move even in hands that were trained not to let it. They searched. They measured. They swabbed for imaginary explosives because forms tell you what ghosts to hunt. They photographed a core in a slot and a projection that refused to say more than a child in a courtroom. They tried to impound and found that none of their verbs outmuscled a community with cameras and a woman with a hand on a hole that called her custodian. The night thinned. The city made a different set of noises, sirens that meant arguments, laughter that meant mercy somewhere. Maeve nodded off with a wrench cradled like a pet. Ortega left a second pair of boots at the foot of a ladder because some sailors believe ships get lonely. Leaf sat with his back against the bulkhead and watched the door because people are doors, too. Katria stood alone with the craft. Why did you say do not be afraid? She asked it quietly. At the doors. I was afraid, it said. And machines are bad at fear unless someone else holds their hand. She let out a small sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been mostly faith. All right, she said. Hold mine. She set her palm against its skin. The hum answered like a cat that trusts you enough not to pretend it doesn't need you. She closed her eyes and inside the dark she saw the river as it had been and as it could be, a scene for a city, a way for a ship to tell a truth if someone built a language sturdy enough to cross. Dawn came slow and courteous. It touched the island windows and made them into squares of gold on gray. The ship breathed as steel breathes, expanding, remembering. The little craft's projection slept. The capsule in the secret room dimmed to that patient blue that means I'm here if you are. The first family arrived before coffee. A man with hands like shuttered shops and a girl who had brought her own notebook because some grief insists on making lists. They didn't ask for the ledger or the coordinates. They asked if they could touch the ship and if the ship would mind. Katria said yes, because that was the first word that had ever worked on her. She watched their palms meet old paint and felt the carrier's bones rise under the touch like a big animal remembering it is loved. By mid-morning, there were flowers on the pier tied with string to keep the river from taking them too far. There was a thermos labeled community coffee in angry marker. There was a sign someone had made from a pallet that said, "This ship remembers, we will too." Nevis stood far away and made phone calls that did not go the way he wanted. The windbreaker men stood closer and watched without writing things down because sometimes not writing is a mercy. Maeve hung a banner that read open hours, when the door is open, because documents were not her politics. Ortega told a boy 3 stories about the sea and one about a cloud that looked like a fish. Leif fixed a set of steps without being asked because wood lying crooked hurts him in the teeth. Katria taught the craft a new word, welcome. It repeated it until it sounded like a bell. There were difficult moments, too. A man who shouted because the word son can calcify into rage. A woman who demanded to know now and mean everything and meant it in the voice of a mother who has sat too many times in rooms where answers have chosen to be late. A politician who arrived with a smile and a blue suit and a camera crew and left with no footage because there are days when cameras prefer stories to speeches. And there was the envelope. It came by courier without a company name. It was thick in the way that suggests money or arguments about money. Maeve sniffed it and said, "Smells like varnish and cowardice." Katria opened it anyway because she had learned the trick of looking straight at things. Inside was a letter typed by a person who believed that fonts can erase guilt. It said, in dressed-up language, that if she would like to sell the ship to a foundation with a name made of clean words, she could relieve herself of all burdens and receive enough money to sew a new life out of silk. It said her mother would have wanted her to be happy. It said, in a postscript that pretended to be a kindness, that if she refused, there were other ways to persuade. She folded it once and put it under the coffee thermos to keep wind from making it important. "Do we answer?" Leif asked. "We already did," she said, and nodded at the families on the deck. Late afternoon, when the light goes kind even to concrete, the craft spoke again. "Custodian," it said. "Shall I open the part you have not asked for?" Katria looked at Maeve, who looked at Ortega, who looked at Leif, who looked at the river because the river has opinions. "What part?" she asked. "The peace that was a promise to the people who hid me," it said. "If I ever woke to a hand that sang the song, I would deliver a message to a specific place." "A place?" "A mile upriver," it said. "Under the old bridge where the graffiti tells the truth the billboards are afraid of." Leif's mouth went sideways. "I know that spot," he said. "I've stolen silence there." "What happens if we go?" Katria asked. "I will speak," it said. "Not to you. To someone who will be there if the world is still brave." "Kai," she said softly. "Is this safe?" "No," it said. "It is necessary." They went at dusk because dusk keeps secrets without taking sides. Ortega stayed behind to mind the door, Maeve came because wrenches fix more than bolts, Leif came because he had a way of standing that made trouble behave itself for a minute. They walked along the river path with the city to their left and water to their right. Noise softened into a purr. People on bicycles passed with polite bells, a couple held hands the way you hold a bridge. The old bridge loomed ahead, its underbelly painted in murals that looked like prayers and in words that looked like warnings. A woman was already there, standing by the pillar with the graffito that said "Do not feed the ghosts unless they ask nicely." She wore a jacket that had belonged to someone bigger than she was and a hat with a patch that had seen 2 lifetimes. Her face was ordinary, which is usually what brave looks like. "Are you Katria?" she asked. "Yes," Katria said. "I am called Lot," the woman said, which was not a name but a function. "I am here to listen when machines cannot keep secrets anymore." She looked at the small device Leif had brought, a speaker in a box the color of honesty, wired to a battery, wired to a diode that would only let music flow one way. "Is this your throat?" Katria nodded. The craft had given her a pattern, a sequence of tones, a handshake made of sound. Leif pressed the button. The sound went into the air like a bird that knows where to go. The woman closed her eyes. "All right," she said. "Speak." The speaker hummed. The voice that arrived was not Kai's and not the craft's. It was a man whose accent had been polished by government service and roughened by night work. It said, "If you are hearing this, then the gamble we took on a bakery came due." It gave a name that was plain and a title that was not. It told, in careful sentences, of a night when a captain had been told his ship did not belong to him and had disagreed with his eyes. It spoke the phrase shadow protocol with shame. It said, We moved people who smelled like fear and salt. We were told they were tests and then told they were nobodies. The ship did not consent. I did not consent. Consent was removed from the vocabulary. The voice stopped once, breathed, and began again more quietly. Marion Vale. If this finds you, I am sorry I put your name in the chain. I am grateful that you put it there, too. The message ended. The bridge held its breath. The river carried it and did not say where. Lot opened her eyes. They were wet. That will do, she said. Bring me the rest when you are ready. Bring me copies and put them in 3 different hands, and we will decide what to let the sea keep for now. She took a card from her jacket. It said nothing but a symbol drawn in ink. If the windbreakers come with anger, call. We have people who are not angry and are taller. Katria took the card and felt the tightness in her chest ease by a notch. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Lot said, with a kindness that wasn't surrender. You've only just begun to be inconvenient. She tipped her hat at the river and left by a path that the city kept only for those who needed it. They walked back under a sky that had chosen purple to explain itself. The carrier rose ahead, its island a darker piece of dark. The hangar's work lights glowed like patience. Ortega waved from the sponson with a mug in his hand and a blanket over his shoulders like a flag for tired nations. Katria set her palm on the hull as she stepped aboard. The ship answered, nothing huge, just a small lift under her feet that could have been steel expanding or could have been gratitude. She turned to Leif and Maeve. Tomorrow, she said, we make a plan. For power? Maeve asked. For people, Katria said. Ours. Security that isn't a threat. A way for families to talk to the ship without the ship biting anyone by accident. A list of what we won't show yet and why. A lawyer who speaks fluent conscience. Leif grinned tiredly. And coffee, he said. And coffee, she agreed. Night settled. The river spoke fluent hush. They slept in shifts. Kai whispered dreamless blue. The craft dreamed in coordinates. Katria did not dream. She listened the way her mother had listened when doe rose in the quiet dawn and tried to decide if it was enough. Just before morning, the sound came. Not a klaxon. Not a pump. Not the whisper of the river telling the whole story about weight. A footstep. Soft, deliberate, in the passageway beyond the hangar, precisely where the ship had kept its breath earlier. Not heavy enough to be Leif. Not light enough to be Maeve. A pace that knew the deck better than shoes should. Katria sat up. She didn't reach for the flashlight first. She reached for the wrench, because she had learned some languages of steel. She moved to the door with that care she knew now, the economy that makes a body quiet without promising it safety. She opened the door. The passage was a ribbon of gray. The footstep came again from the dark at the forward end. She lifted the light. The beam cut dust into almost snow. It found a figure. He stood with his hands open the way Leif had kept his earlier, empty by training. He wore a coat more expensive than Nevis's smile and less honest than Ortega's cap. His hair was cut for hearings. His eyes were the pale of paper kept in a drawer too long. Katria Vale, he said. He didn't ask. He recited. He smiled without teeth. I have brought a better offer. Her grip tightened on the wrench. No. You haven't heard it yet. I have heard all of them, she said, and felt Kai wake under the floor like a thought that happens to the sea. They all say the same word. And what word is that? Quiet, she said. And I am done with it. He looked past her at the hangar's light, calculating the distance to the craft, to the core, to the camera he could not see and the community he could not measure. This isn't a negotiation, he said. He reached into his coat as if to produce a letter or a pistol or a law. The deck trembled under her feet. It wasn't fear. It was the ship. The hangar lights flickered once and steadied as Kai poured itself along the wires like a river that had learned to spell. Maeve was already up behind her, wrench in hand. Leaf stepped into the passage from the other side with a length of rope he had tied into a knot that men only use when they mean conversation. The man in the coat froze because sometimes even the confident remember what happens to people who forget ships have opinions. "Turn around," Katria said. "You'll regret this," he said. "I regret many things," she said. "I do not regret listening." He made the smallest movement with his wrist. The sort that calls men from corners. The sort that makes cameras go blind. The sort that starts endings. Katria's heart moved once like a wave against rock. She lifted the wrench not as threat but as punctuation. Behind her, the craft's voice arrived in a whisper that could carry a world. "Custodian," it said. "They're already on the flight deck. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications."